Hello, I am Mudita, and welcome back to Satisfactory. All of the kittens and puppies have been saved. Probably. Maybe. So today, I'm going to take you on a world tour of the save that got me here. I am sharing this save, the spreadsheet, blueprints, and diagrams for free on my Google Drive. Link down below. There are a lot of factories. In the interest of time, I'm going to give a brief overview of most of them and spend a little bit more time talking about the lessons I've learned. Let's go ahead and start this tour with the oldest factory of the save, smart plating. If I'm not mistaken, because it's been so long and I'd actually have to go back and watch the old footage, I believe this is the only factory that is still standing from phase 1. Everything else I built in that phase was temporary and ended up getting deleted. So there's just no evidence of it ever existing anymore. The last time I did a world save, I added the text on the screen of what the factory was, what the inputs and outputs were, just kind of the basic information for each of the factories. I thought it was useful, and it seemed like it was beneficial to all of you. But since I'd like to share this world, and instead of having to reference the video or just kind of trying to figure it out on your own, I thought a much better way to do this would be to put a sign in front of all the different factories. So instead of putting it on screen this time, I thought it would be much better to actually have it in the world. That way, if you do download the save and you want to check out any of the factories, it's a little bit easier to figure out what's going on than having to hunt everything down. Because there's so many factories and I just can't come up with that many different ideas to display it, I just came up with a blueprint. So you're going to see a lot of this. And I think this does a good enough job at displaying all the relevant information. So originally, this factory right here was just the smart plating, and that part only takes a whopping 93 iron ore, and that's all it needs. Eventually, I added on because smart plating then goes into modular engines, so I just added that factory right next to it. Then I needed to bring in a little bit more iron ore, and then the quick wire and the rubber are coming in by train. This very first factory has a brand new addition to it. To better explain the new addition, let me load up an older save. This is what it looked like for hundreds of hours. So here on the inside, as we can see, we're a little bit backed up on screws, which is not what's supposed to be happening. Now, at least the number is reading correctly, but it's not supposed to be doing that. And if I come up here, I'm completely full on screws. And over here, I'm completely full on plates, but barely enough screws. And this one is running at 98%. Which means that my smart plating is running at 98%. And if I go next door and check my modular frames, right now it's saying 100%, but as we can see, the rubber is completely full and the motors are starting to get full. So even though that machine says 98%, I think a lot of the time it actually says 100%, and I just happened to catch it right when it did screw up. What I'm doing is I've got two machines making screws. Each one is making 74 screws, and I needed to split that 100 going one way and 48 going the other way. So my solution was to use a smart splitter, and then using a section of fastener belt with the Mark II right here, I could limit it down to 60. See, it catches up, and then I can do my load balancing off of the 60. It made sense, and it clearly worked pretty well, 99.5% or higher probably. So with this and the next factory, it's not really the end of the world. It's because those modular engines go to the thermal propulsion rockets, and because that factory has a bunch of sushi belts, if that factory isn't running at 100%, eventually something is going to back up and the whole thing will just come to a halt. So my solution was to go from this to this. Even though it's glass, it's a little bit easier to see if the floor isn't there. Using smart splitters and manipulating the speeds for belts to get the right amounts can definitely work, but I don't think it's nearly as foolproof as just doing the good old ratio split. As long as I build these correctly, they pretty much never fail me. So that's just what I went with. One last new diagram for the save. Instead of working with the initial 74, which is getting plugged into that merger, I'm looping back 7 so that I can work with 81. since that's a power of 3, I can just split it into thirds a few times. And then with one of those initial thirds, which is 27, just need to do a little bit more load balancing. And we've got the 100 and the 48. And I can double check. We've got my throughput monitors up here. Well, apparently these numbers don't stay consistent. Go figure. Usually with screws and wire and quick wire, because you're making them in such high amounts that the machines end up being pretty bursty, and the throughput monitors just don't like that. But thankfully now, this one's reading 100, this one's reading 100, and the smart plating's reading 100. And then as far as the modular frame factory goes, it's very similar. It just has a train station as the very bottom floor, even though underneath that it has the logistics. That way I could bring in the quick wire and the rubber and then ship out the final product. And speaking of trains, let's go ahead and just follow this train line. These right here are some of the very first train tracks I laid, which brings me to another lesson learned. Somehow on this downward section of ramps right here, it's probably this section because it's the ugliest looking one. For whatever reason, I didn't stick to a consistent like 1 meter ramp all the way down or anything like that, and that's why it has that wavy section. And I didn't notice this until way late. What I'm not crazy about is the fact that I somehow got off of the world grid with the height. So the very large majority of the train tracks are completely off grid in every way possible. Which is something I kind of regret, because I think it would have been easier and just a little bit less hassle, made a couple spots look a little bit cleaner throughout the world is probably the biggest difference. The rails are very flexible, and so merging on and off the grid in any of the directions isn't really all that bad. But I also like when the rails look smooth, and not like that. Alright, let's move on with the tour. So I'm going to go somewhat in order of the towers that I built. However, if there's a nearby factory, instead of hopping all over the world, especially towards the end, I'm just going to highlight them while we're here. Which brings us to the Rocky Desert. So first up, we've got the iron tower on the left, and the motors and rotors on the right. It's kind of fun going back and visiting some of these early factories, because you get to see just how simple it was. 270 iron ore turns into all of these different parts. And the whole point of this and all of these early game factories were just to supply my dimensional depots. So if we come on inside, right at the very beginning, we've just got a hallway of all of my different items. Things like the screws, I just never actually ended up putting into my dimensional depot, because you really just don't need that much. But it felt like I should always have just some laying around, so that if I needed some, I didn't have to create a whole bunch. And if I really thought that I needed some going into a dimensional depot, I could have added it. But as you can see, for most of these basic parts, I created a blueprint that had 3 of the industrial storage containers. This way, for things like the iron plates, I always had almost 30,000 plates just ready to go. And with 3 dimensional depots attached, my upload speed is 720 items per minute for pretty much all of these basic items. It's also simple in the beginning. Yes, it's a very basic factory, but it is really rewarding to be able to come back to these and just see everything working just the way it's supposed to. Nothing is backed up, all of the belts are just moving along. It's just been working like a charm for 500-600 hours. You'll love to see it. Now let's take a brief look at the rotors and motors factory. Using good old alternate recipes, I can make all of this with just the 212 iron ore, and I'll have 4 rotors and 3 motors a minute going to my dimensional depots, and that was plenty for the entire save. We were just looking at those 2 factories. And if we come to the other side, basically, of the Rocky Desert, pretty close to the coast, we can look at the steel beams and versatile framework tower. So this was the first time that I needed to include coal, but 165 iron, 150 coal, provided me with 30 steel beams per minute, which was more than enough for the save, and 4 of the versatile framework that are feeding the magnetic field generators. Here we can see the final product headed out from this factory, and just go ahead and right to the next one. This was another pretty standard tower. I've got my storage and dimensional depots here in the very front. And there's extra room here because for a while I had a forced storage container and I just had the versatile framework going into there until I got through that phase, and then I just deleted it when I didn't need it, ship them over to the next factory. After I built that tower, then I came right down here and built this one. This one got to be even shorter. It really doesn't take a whole lot to make the automated wiring. Just 232 iron ore makes 6 a minute. And these feed into the adaptive control unit factory. We come to the other side, we can see those just head right on over to this factory. As we can see from the outside, another pretty basic factory. I'm making 6 a minute because that's just the easiest and the most convenient the way the numbers all worked out. But I'm actually only shipping 5 a minute to the next factory, so I still have a sync here and I'm just syncing 1 per minute. And that right there was all I needed to complete phase 2. Obviously I wasn't done in the rocky desert, so let's move on to phase 3. The first factory I built was actually all the way the other side. First thing I needed to do in phase 3, make some modular frames and encase industrial beams. I don't know why I didn't do it more often. I really should have just left some of my factories a little bit more open like this. It's kind of nice not having the windows. With the alternate recipes I decided to use, I only need 336 iron ore and 150 limestone, and I've got 4 modular frames and 10 encased industrial beams headed to my dimensional depot. In the early game, you just don't have a ton of Mercer spheres, so the large majority of these early factories only started with 1 dimensional depot. Then once I have a good amount, then I come back and I just start adding more. Apparently, I only added a second one to these, and that was more than enough. I never felt the need to come back and add a third one. Another factory that it was just so nice to come back to, everything just working like a charm. And now we come back to the main side of the desert. This is my one and only concrete factory. For as much concrete as I've gone through, I am kind of surprised that this was enough. I'm going to throw my save into the Satisfactory Calculator interactive map and we can take a look at some of the stats. But this right here provided all of the concrete for the entire world. And the large majority of the time, it was just 1 water extractor and 1 refinery. I think this was the only factory that I had expandability in mind when I built it. So I picked a pure node because I knew by the end of the game I could get 1200 limestone out of it. Obviously, in the earlier game, I was probably only using a Mark II miner at that point, so I was able to get 300, which was a great start. Because with the wet concrete recipe, I can turn 300 limestone into 200 concrete per minute. And then eventually, as I got better belts and then the better miners, I could get that upgraded to use the full 1200 limestone, and I can get 800 concrete per minute out of it. And this is what that ended up looking like. A whole lot of dimensional depots. So first, the 200 goes into a smart splitter. That way, once the storage fills up, then we can have the overflow go off into a sink. But from here, I created a new blueprint, basically just for this factory. Instead of using the large storage containers, a small storage container will still hold 12,000. And so we'll just do some quick math. Each one of these containers will get an even 50. So when I'm placing a whole bunch of concrete, I'll be refilling the dimensional depots as fast as possible, which is 240 per minute, but I'm also refilling these at 50 per minute. So really, I'll only be draining these at 210 per minute. And this is the reason why I'm using the small storage containers. I need to constantly be using concrete for 57 minutes before I would drain this entire thing. If I used the large storage containers, it would just double that. And I just didn't see myself ever needing a constant supply of concrete for more than an hour. So in my opinion, you can save yourself some space and just use the small storage containers for concrete. For other things, you definitely still want to use the bigger ones, but I really think for concrete, you're fine with the small one, if you're refilling them this quickly. Right next door, we have my copper sheets factory. Now this is one of the only basic items that I decided to maximize early and just kind of have some extra available for the future factories. I'm still up in the air with whether that was worth it or not, because for a lot of the other basic items like iron rods or iron plates, I don't want to make a whole bunch in one spot and then have to ship them out. Iron's everywhere. It's so much easier just to make it on location. Because I knew I was going to need a pretty healthy amount of copper in the very end game, especially to make 40 ballistic warp drives per minute, I wanted to try to be really efficient with the little bits that I used in the beginning. So using only 150 copper ore with the pure copper ingot and the steam copper sheets recipe, I was able to turn that into 375 copper sheets per minute, 25 of which I have going to the dimensional depot. Even from the very beginning, I was really a big fan of just having one machine just directly feed into a couple more machines instead of grouping it all together and re-splitting it up. And then from the copper sheets factory, I built a couple more that weren't in the desert, but I think it'll be easiest just to stay here real quick. But let's finish going through the ones here in the desert, and then I'll show you those other factories. So next up were the heavy modular frames and the adaptive control units. This one, I clearly wanted to put all of the lifts on display in the very front, and I like the way that it came out. Here we finally start needing to bring in some other parts. This factory started with just the heavy modular frames and the adaptive control units, and then because I was already making heavy modular frames, it was pretty easy just to add on the one fuse modular frame that I wanted to send to the dimensional depot. So in total, these are all of the parts to make all three different things. The frames are primarily just there for my dimensional depots. The adaptive control units then go on to feed the assembly director systems. I don't know how long it was missing that 1.5 foundation, but now it's all complete. I feel good about that. So I changed my mind. We are going to just stick with which phases. Let's go take a look at what else I built. One of the things I did in phase 3 was come out to the west coast and build my first plastic and rubber factory and the accompanying train station, which ended up becoming probably the second largest train station. And with a few thousand plastic and rubber getting shipped out of here, works like a charm. But let's take a look at the first plastic and rubber factory. 300 crude oil, and because it was early on in the game, I am using both normal water, and then I felt like I should just distinguish I am using packaged water. Doesn't really matter, and in some of the other factories I probably don't even make that distinction. But I felt like because at this point of the game I was using the diluted packaged fuel, it was different than all the rest of them. And that gets turned into 400 plastic, 500 rubber, and I'm sending 25 of each to the dimensional depots. Another factory I wanted to put the final products on display. I like it. I do much prefer to use the diluted fuel and just not have to deal with the packagers, but it's really not too bad. Next up, the first Caterium factory. This and the copper sheets, for the same reason I waited till phase 3 because I really wanted the refineries to set up a first real factory. I could have set them up earlier, but the pure recipes are just so nice for things like Caterium, where instead of 3 ore to 1 ingot, now it's 2 to 1. So I could turn that 300 Caterium ore into 750 quick wire per minute, and I'm sending way more than I need. 150 of it is going to dimensional depots. Nice and simple factory where we've just got the refineries feeding straight into the constructors. Next up, my first quartz and silica factory. I'm taking the raw quartz from the 2 impure nodes nearby, the limestone that's right next door, and thankfully water is also really close. I'm able to make 175 of each of them. And as you can see, those numbers probably aren't really ideal. I do have a train station here, but I am shipping very little out of here. And that's because I just did not leave enough room. I've got one train station here, and because I only have one train station, I'm really limited on what I can actually ship out of here. So as I learned with this and plastic and rubber, if you're only making, 1 or 2 things, you're probably just going to need a whole bunch of different train stations. it's not going to be very easy just to have multiple trains just use different freight platforms, because you can't just say, well, pick up quartz if 3 of the different freight platforms have quartz. You can definitely get around that problem, but it's definitely something you have to keep in mind. So I would say that is my main takeaway with this one. I really like the way that the factory looks. When you really don't need that many machines, it becomes a whole lot easier to be able to design something fun around it. I just didn't really utilize this nearly as well as I probably could have, because it ended up being that most of this was just going to my dimensional depot, which means that 99.99% of all of it was just sunk. But at the same time, it's really nice to have an ample supply of both quartz crystal and silicone once you get to the later game, in case you want to spam down a whole bunch of signs or a whole bunch of windows. So I really don't have much to complain about. This all worked out great for me. The reason I haven't showed you a power plant yet is phase 3 was the first time I decided to build a permanent power plant. In the very beginning, obviously I had the biomass, those all got deleted, and then I had a decent sized coal power plant, but I really felt that in the end game, the coal would be much more valuable as its own resource, as opposed to the amount of power that you actually get from it. Once you move past coal power, it doesn't really give you a whole lot, but it got me to the point where I could build turbo fuel. With 270 crude oil, 720 packaged water, because I'm still using the diluted packaged fuel recipe at this point, the 480 coal, which is actually coming by train, because the closest coal from here is up in the red jungle, or red forest, whatever it is, and then 480 sulfur. There we go. I forgot to delete the outputs. The output is 20,000 megawatts. So here we have on the first floor our packaged water coming in, our packaged fuel going up to the second floor. And as you can see, I decorated the center of each of these, gave myself a little bit of space to work with, and I could place a whole bunch of batteries because I thought, if I'm going to build a permanent power plant, we should build some backup storage just in case things go wrong. So this provided a good amount of power for the early game and a decent amount of backup battery power. And on the second floor, we just unpackaged that packaged fuel, combine it with the compacted coal that we're also making, and I've got my turbo fuel. And the whole reason I set it up like this was just so I could show off these pipes. So there's the turbo fuel on its short little journey that just goes straight back down to the first floor, and then on either side, we've got the rows of generators. This factory did need a little bit of tinkering with here and there, but I was able to get most of that done really early. And then from then on, I just had a really consistent 20,000 megawatts to use. In the past, I pretty much always skipped over turbo fuel. But seeing how little crude oil, sulfur, and coal that you need to provide this much power, I'm really happy that I did it this time around. And then I came all the way out to the edge of the Titan Forest and the Desert Canyons, and I built my electronics factory. As you can tell, I did quite a bit of exploring in phase 3, so this is where I really started to pick up a lot more of the Mercer spheres, the summer sloops, and hard drives. And realized that there is just a ton of lizardagos over here, and hey, they provided quite a few goodies early on in the game. I'll never complain about an extra few slugs. For the electronics factory, this one needed quite a few different parts, and not everything was required all at once. Obviously, in phase 3, I didn't have the Fixite Trigons yet. The supercomputers, assembly director systems, and the biochemical sculptors were all added later on. So in total, these are the inputs, and these are the outputs. The large majority of this was just to feed my dimensional depots. That is my preferred strategy. Phases 1 through 4 are pretty much just to build factories to supply your dimensional depots, so then you can just build whatever you want. There are only a few parts, like the plastic, rubber, aluminum, things like that. I find it's easiest just to maximize a node. Like if I'm going to make plastic or rubber, I'm just going to use all the crude oil of that node and make as much as I can. But with things like AI limiters or high-speed connectors, I would much rather just build a factory to supply my dimensional depots, and then when I need them for a future part, I'll just build them there inside that factory. In phase 3, this production stopped at computers, which was basically this row of all of these machines right here. To make supercomputers, I just needed to add one assembler to make some more AI limiters, and then one more manufacturers to make the supercomputers. And because let's be honest, I don't need that many supercomputers, I am only making one per minute, and I am splitting that in half. So I actually only have 0.5 supercomputers per minute headed to my dimensional depot. Because over here, I need 0.5 supercomputers. I have this loop to make 2 assembly director systems, and then that feeds into my 1 blender making biochemical sculptors. As much as I would have loved to build a gigantic endgame factory for all the different parts, I decided I was going to focus on the one that gave me the most points, meaning the biochemical sculptor kind of got shafted, only making 8 a minute, and that's just because I was able to easily sloop some things. But even 8 a minute provides a decent amount of sync points. And to wrap up phase 3, we have my new hub home factory. My original starting location was here in the northern forest, but it was right over there, where we will eventually make it to an endgame factory. That one's making copper powder. That's where all of the phase 1 factories, if you can even call those factories, that's where they were. But I wanted to move most of those into a more permanent location. And there were a number of things that I wanted to make that I didn't necessarily want to attach or build it just its own factory for. So here you go. In total, those are all of the different inputs that I needed. Just some iron, copper, coal, sulfur. Later on, then I brought in some aluminum ingots. And then at the very end, I brought in some alien power matrices. And then on the right, you can see this is making a lot of those items that are just really convenient to have. Don't necessarily need, but it sure does make life a lot easier. The package fuel and turbo fuel are way more than I ever needed, but the numbers were just really convenient to work with. And then with the package turbo fuel, I could also make some turbo rifle ammo. And as far as parts wise, I would say turbo rifle ammo is easier to produce, but after having used it primarily for the save, I can still confidently say I think homing rifle is my preferred ammo. I just have horrible aim, and that just helps. The very bottom floor has some logistics and a train station. And then if we come up here to the first real floor, we've got all of our manufacturing. So clearly I came up with a different style of blueprints that I really only used in this factory, where I elevated a lot of the machines, giving me a whole lot of the floor to still work with. I was able to use that section to get belts going from one direction to the next, so it became a little bit chaotic, but if you can guess, I kind of like the way this stuff looks. So some of these machines aren't always going to be running. Not my preferred thing, but this right here is making liquid biofuel, so it's only going to make it when I have solid biofuel to feed it. And so the rest of the time, these extra canisters don't have anywhere to go, so they're just being sunk. And then we've got the next floor where we're doing a lot more of the production. And then we've got the top floor where I've got my 2 alien power augmenters. To fully power these things, each one needs 5 of the alien power matrices. But look at that 30% boost that we're getting. Each one of these is giving me a boost of 106,000 megawatts. You'll see it fluctuate up every once in a while, and that's just the way power works in this game. You get a little bonus power when trains break. They have regenerative breaks, and since this boost is off the total production, I'll just get some free megawatts every once in a while. So in total, 213 out of my 568 is just coming from these 2 guys. Well, that and the factory that's making all the matrices. And then we have the top floor, which is almost never actually running. That's because this floor is dealing with all of my remains, the biomass, and turning the slugs into power shards. And this was always kind of my backup. So if we highlight all of these constructors, there should be, you can see I've got 11 of the summer sloops tied up with just these constructors. And then the refinery that's making the liquid biofuel also has 2 of them. So I always had that in my back pocket. I always had an emergency 13 summer sloops that if I really needed them, especially at the end game, I could come back over here and take them all out. They serve their biggest purpose early on in the game, and then especially now that I have power shards automated, I don't really even need half of these. But this right here was home sweet home. The new location for my hub. And eventually I added a portal back here. So then it became really easy to get from here to any other factory in under 30 seconds. And then obviously with this cool new home factory, it had to be the place where I put the space elevator. So that just got placed right in front. And that is where I completed phase 3 and the rest of the phases. So now we can move on to the phase 4 factories. Phase 4 brings me out to the Eastern Dune Forest, which is right on the edge of the Titan Forest, right above the Blue Crater. And there's 2 reasons I picked this location. I've just never really built much here. I usually just kind of shipped out these resources if I ever needed them. And 2, it's pretty centrally located. So I thought being able to build a train station that turned into my busiest train station. The first thing I built out here was aluminum, so I wanted to be able to ship that out to wherever I needed to. Let's take a look at this first aluminum factory. With aluminum, I'll often set up just a really basic temporary factory just to get everything started. But when I want to make a permanent one, I usually wait until I have the sloppy alumina and the electrode aluminum scrap alternate recipes, and the pure aluminum ingot. This factory is taking 1800 bauxite, and it's turning it all into aluminum ingots, and then some of them are then getting turned into aluminum sheets and aluminum casing. And again, with the common theme of where I can just pair up machines, I usually do. And then on the top floor, it's just the smelters. From that aluminum factory and the train station, I then went to the other side of this area, right on the border of the Blue Crater, and I built this tower, which is making my turbo motors. As you can tell by the big belt highway heading to the factory, this one has a few things coming from the train station. And in turn, it is making 3 turbo motors, 4 radio control units, and 3 cooling devices. This was one of the few times where I did try to plan just a little bit ahead, and as you can see, I'm making 3 turbo motors, but only one of them is going to the dimensional depot. And that's because not too long after I built this factory, I built that red factory, which is making the thermal propulsion rockets, and that needed 2 turbo motors per minute. I was willing to plan ahead for the current phase, but I wasn't going to try to build, the total amount of turbo motors that I was going to need for the whole playthrough just in this phase. But before we get to those thermal propulsion rockets, I needed to build the nuclear pasta factory. This is making a whopping 1 per minute, but I didn't need too many just to finish phase 4. And because I was going to need fused modular frames to make the pasta, I just decided to make 2 extra ones so that those could also then feed the thermal propulsion rocket factory. Now with those 2 factories built, now we can look at the thermal propulsion rocket factory. Thankfully, with the fused modular frames, the turbo motors out of the way, I was just able to belt those over. The aluminum was also nearby, and the train station is actually built right on top of a nitrogen node. So more than half of the items were really close, and then I just needed to bring in the copper sheets, rubber, and modular engines. And this is pumping out 2 thermal propulsion rockets per minute, and then I'm putting those on a train, sending them out to the grassy fields. That is for the next phase. The only other space elevator part I needed for this phase was the assembly director systems, and I already showed that off at the electronics factory. There's just one last major thing I did here in phase 4 that I almost forgot about, but it's kind of hard to miss. Those big towers in the background. I don't know how I forgot about it, and we went slightly out of order here, but this was actually probably the second thing I built in phase 4. The train station and those towers. First, I needed this little itty bitty factory back here. It's turning the crude oil into heavy oil residue, and then taking the heavy oil residue and turning that into the petroleum coke I need for the aluminum factory. And then I built my towers. Definitely a whole bunch of blueprints, which uses up a whole ton of materials when you want to stack this many of them, but it was totally worth it. If we come down over to here, because this little section is related to the whole factory, I'm taking a whopping 300 crude oil, 400 coal, 800 sulfur, 720 nitrogen gas, a little over 1,000 water, and a whole 10 iron plates. And that is generating 72,000 megawatts, which I think almost quadrupled the power at that point, which is fantastic. And then I ended up having a byproduct of 254 rubber because of the polymer resin, and 150 package rocket fuel, which I then ended up using 40 of it in that factory over there, but that's for the next phase. The way this giant monstrosity is working is most of the items are coming in right down underneath. So if we head inside, this is what it ended up looking like. It's pretty chaotic, but part of it is because I decided to not build it directly on the world grid, and I tilted the whole thing at a 45-degree angle. Because if we look at the compass, that is north, and everything is offset by 45 degrees, which made some of the logistics inside a little bit messy, and that's why I covered it. On the bottom section of each tower, it's a really simple setup. You just need one refinery to make the heavy oil residue. The first blender then makes the fuel, and then the last blender then takes the fuel, the coal, the sulfur, and the nitrogen, and makes that wonderful rocket fuel. Now, I think I covered everything that I did in Phase 4. So now let's take a look at everything else I made. And I don't need to go far, because the very first thing I needed to do once I got into Phase 5 was make trigons and time crystals. And so this little guy right here is making the time crystals. I really like the oil-based diamond recipe. As you're about to see, I used it a lot. 600 crude oil then becomes 60 time crystals. With power shards, I only need 2 particle accelerators, which is the other reason why I love this, is the whole thing is very simple. Each particle accelerator then feeds into 2 converters, and that's all you need. Then I headed right back up to the Eastern Dune Forest, and I made my trigons. Trigons are also really easy to make, honestly. You've got a couple different recipes, but for the most part, since I wasn't going to use all of the aluminum in the world, I went with that one because it's the most efficient on SAM. So 300 SAM, 300 aluminum ingots, gives me 225 Fixite trigons, and I have 25 of them going to the Dimensional Depot. For whatever reason, I wanted to cram this thing just onto the side of this cliff here. The very first floor is just one constructor making the reanimated SAM. That and the aluminum ingots go into a converter, making the Fixite ingots. And then those feed into 3 constructors. I've got my little amount that's going to my personal storage, and then the rest of it just heads back to the train station. With that automated, that meant I can use the Mark 6 belts as much as I wanted. And from this point, the main goal is going to be to really ramp up power. Because even though at this point in the game I had a pretty good sized buffer, I know to build all the rest of the factories I want to build, it's going to use a lot of power. And that brought me out to the swamp. We've got a train station in the very center, and then the very first thing I built was more aluminum. And since what I was building towards at the time was the nuclear power plant, I wanted to make sure I had a whole bunch of power storage around so I had a good amount of buffer to turn the whole thing on. So I decided to build a whole bunch of the power storage just into the building. This little guy over here is just taking all of the crude oil in that resource well and turning it into petroleum coke. And I forgot to mention, the bottom floor is actually all copper ingot production. The top floor is then all of the aluminum. This one is intaking 3,000 bauxite and turning it all into 3,000 ingots. Once I built that, and I had my train station here, there's a whole bunch of logistics going on underneath, and I split off some of the aluminum ingots and the copper ingots, and I'm making aluminum casing. And then a bunch of that and the things I need from the train are all headed over to here, to this new tower. Here is my pressure conversion cube factory. So now that I was at the very end game and I pretty much had everything unlocked, I felt that it was safe to kind of plan all the rest of the factories. And for some of the more complicated items like pressure conversion cubes, I would rather just make one factory. So going through all the factories that I was going to make in the future, I needed 20. And so here are all the items that I need. About half of them were coming from the train. And all of this just to make a whopping 20 pressure conversion cubes per minute. With all of those pressure conversion cubes built, I could then start turning some of them into singularity cells. Unfortunately, because these need a few particle accelerators and converters, it's a fairly power-hungry part to make. So eventually, all of those pressure conversion cubes are going to get turned into singularity cells, but at this point in the game, I didn't have the power to do that. So because I already had a factory that is producing 1 nuclear pasta per minute, I decided didn't want that to go to waste, so put that on a train along with all the pressure conversion cubes, and then I split off 4 of them just to come over to here. I picked the desert because there is a ton of iron, copper, and limestone. And then 30 of the singularity cells are going to the power plant, 20 of them are powering my portals. And I think I should try to do something like this more often. I did it because the particle accelerators are just so huge, and it let me keep that middle floor a little bit shorter instead of having to make it bigger just for the particle accelerators. But I really like the way that it ended up looking, having some of the machines on the outside. So that's something I'm going to have to keep in mind for the next time. And like I said, 20 of them are going to my portal tower, but I'm going to save that till last. 30 of them just go on a journey across the desert to that thing. But before we get to that thing, we have to look at this one. This right here is making all of the kind of basic parts that I needed for the nuclear power plant. So instead of doing everything in one giant factory, I thought it would be easiest if I split it up just a little bit more. About half the items are coming by train. This is producing all of the dark matter residue, all of the steel parts, heat sinks, the electromagnetic control rods, and the good old sulfuric acid that I need. Which finally brings me to another lesson learned. Originally, all of these pipes down here were just Mark 1 pipes. And that's because each one of these needs 100 water. And in the past, I haven't had an issue using the full 300 on a Mark 1 pipe. But for whatever reason, that was one of the issues that came up with this power plant. Is very, very slowly, the 2 end ones would start getting starved for water. But ever since I changed all of it to Mark 2 pipes, even though I'm only moving 300 in each one of these, I've had no problems, and all of the machines have been staying completely full. But here's to hoping 1.2 kind of solves these problems. I'll keep my fingers crossed. But other than that small issue with the pipes, this factory has been smooth sailing. All of those parts are just being shipped right over here to my nuclear power plant. And for using 1200 uranium, if you use alternate recipes, you can generate a whole lot more than the 262.5 gigawatts that I'm producing here. But the benefit of using a lot of default recipes is I got to keep things simple. And if you come inside, you can kind of see. For the most part, I got to spread everything out so that it wasn't all super cramped. And I decided to use a whole lot of the Mark 6 belts so that there wasn't a whole lot of waiting around, and I didn't have to mess around with a whole bunch of sinks in places to just kind of wait for the next thing to get there. This whole factory came to life really pretty quickly. And this was one of the places where I did leave a permanent uh-oh kind of solution. Because I had my little meltdown in the past, I decided to make both the Trigons and the electromagnetic control rods smart splitters here. And so if for whatever reason these back up, then the overflow will then get merged onto this belt and head to the back here and go to a sink. And the reason for that is both of these items are coming in on a sushi belt, and obviously the Trigons are coming in at a pretty high rate. And since I had, a little hiccup before that had backed things up, that was the main culprit of making the majority of the factory shut down. As long as I'm getting rid of the Trigons and the electromagnetic control rods, the 2 other floors will run fine for quite a long time before enough builds up here that things will start to back up. Which may or may not have happened while I was cleaning everything up, and now instead of just 1 storage container, I have a little bit of extra. But this right here is my emergency backup battery. Now I've got 4,000 Fixonium laying around that if, things really just took a nosedive in this world, I could connect a belt right here, and that would get these two completely overclocked power plants running, each of them producing 6,025 megawatts. So I would have a nice 12,500 megawatts to work with to start getting all the other power plants up and running again. It would not be a fun situation to be in, but this right here would last for hours and hours, so I would be able to figure things out. Thankfully, never had to use it. And for the most part, this factory has worked great. I'm pretty sure I've narrowed down my two major hiccups to my plastic production, and then also those water pipes for the sulfuric acid. I mentioned plastic, so let's come back out here to the West Coast and talk about it. I went over the first plastic and rubber factory, and then the other ones are honestly super similar. I just scaled things up for the most part, and they're all just going to the train station and then being split up and shipped off to wherever they need to go. This one right here was the second plastic and rubber factory that I built. And the way I usually go about these is I build one of these and it'll produce fairly close to equal amounts of plastic and rubber. And then once I need more, then I just build the next factory. So with things like this, I do like to maximize the node, and so I'm using the full 600 crude oil out of a pure node, and it produces 800 plastic and 1000 rubber. So the issue with this factory is the very end ones would end up being starved for oil. And now it's really only the very end one that'll fluctuate a little bit. Everything else fills up completely. And the way I needed to fix that was create a loop. I was hoping that by bringing in the full 600 pipe and then using the vertical pipeline junction, that this would just work out fine. But even if you try to let all of the pipes fill up, as soon as the machines start running, you're going to end up creating some sort of sloshing in the pipes anyways. And so by looping it and creating just one pipe that goes from one end all the way to the other end and just creates one big loop with this, that seems to have solved the issue with this factory. This factory, unfortunately, was a little bit more complicated. Because of the way that I wanted to set everything up and the rates I wanted to use, it meant that these refineries needed this kind of awkward amount. And it just wasn't going to be easy to split up, a 600 or a 300 pipe into the correct amount of refineries. So my solution was just to package it. And then I could do the load balancing with the packaged oil, and everything was going to work out much better that way. Because then I can just have this one packager, feed two of them, and the whole thing just works out a whole lot better, right? Well, I squeezed all of the packagers down here, but unfortunately, only these very end four, these two and those two, were the only ones that were running at 100%. The rest of them were really close, but it was, 98 or 99%. And the difference is these four right here are all being fed by a normal node, so there's 300 in this pipe. But I'm using a pure node for this one, and so I am putting the full 600 into here. And so I tried a bunch of different things. Originally, this whole thing wasn't set up like this at all. It was just fed straight down into here. There was a vertical junction right about here. And so that didn't work. So I thought, well, I need to loop it like that other factory. And so I created this whole thing. So the initial pipe is plugging into here, and then it gets split in half, and then it still loops completely. So I was hoping maybe that will work. Give it a couple hours, and it ended up having the same issue. So then I added some pumps. So now there's a pump right before the junction, and then as soon as it splits on either side, then we have some more pumps. And that's still not going to work. In the long run, this is still going to end up being at like 99 or 98%. It seems like it takes a really long time, and it's only really slowly off, but it is off. And eventually this factory is going to be short on a little bit of plastic and rubber, which, give it enough time, means that my world will end up coming to a crash, or at least, major parts of it will. Now, these are the two nodes that are feeding that factory, so the only thing that I could think of would be to just shorten the pipe and have the packagers be right out here, instead of sending the oil into the factory and doing the packaging right down below there. Other than that, and just trying to play with the pipes more and come up with a better way to split it up, I'll admit the way that I set it up is really ugly and probably not the best, but I really thought that, using good old gravity like that, and being able to feed it from above, I was really hoping that that was going to kind of help with the full pipe thing. The pipe issues probably make up more than half of my lessons learned and the unfortunate issues that I've had with this playthrough. Which is a decent segue to look at this factory. Here I'm making the power shards and the alien power matrix, which has the added benefit of also making the package ionized fuel, which is awesome for the jetpack. And the main reason for that is there isn't a way to sync power shards directly. So once my dimensional depot and storage filled up, the only way to get rid of them is to combine them with my rocket fuel. So I unpackage the rocket fuel, make ionized fuel, and then reuse the canisters and package those into ionized fuel. And then when that dimensional depot and storage fill up, now I can sync it. And here is the other spot where I noticed I've had a little bit of issue. And it seems like it will take a very long time. But in a number of these spots where I'm using the full 600 crude oil, I'm only splitting it in half, and it's going into just 2 machines. So it's not like I'm trying to split this up over 20 different machines or something like that. But even then, I noticed that these had hiccups, and I've come back to this factory and these were at like 99% before. But thankfully, out of all of the different pipe issues, the crude oil and splitting it in half seems to be the one that takes the longest to show up, and it's just like ever so slightly off. So maybe it's because of loading the game and the sloshing in the pipes, or I'm not really sure. And I'm just crossing my fingers that any of these pipe issues that I've had are just going to magically go away in the next update. Automating even just a couple of the power shards and having 10 alien power matrix really gave me a nice boost on the power grid. There's one last thing I want to talk about before we leave the swamp. I had another issue, and it was the pipes. So the way this blueprint works is the very first refinery takes in the bauxite, the water, and creates the alumina solution. That feeds out on this side and feeds into the second refinery, which takes in the solution, petroleum coke, and gives me the scrap, which then feeds into the 4 smelters. This needs 300 water, and that was kind of the problem. Is originally I had all of these as Mark 1 pipes, because with the vertical pipeline junction, it should prioritize the amount that's coming out of here, which is 210. And then each one of these pipes only has 180, so it should be splitting 90 and 90. And with this basically being a VIP junction, this should just work, except for you still end up with some amount of sloshing, I think. And it's another thing where it's, 99.5 or 9% efficient. The large majority of the time, it was running fine. But I guess maybe there's still some sloshing or something. I'm not really sure what the issue is. But once I made just those bottom pipes Mark II, that gave me the wiggle room that I needed, and now this whole system runs flawlessly. With my nuclear power plant up and running, that meant I could finally start building the really big factories. Because those quantum encoders, they are pretty power hungry. This one is making my superposition oscillators, which had the added benefit of also having a byproduct of 320 dark matter crystals. I'm turning all of the raw quartz that's in the cave down below into the quartz crystal, and obviously the pure quartz crystal is the best way to do it if that's the only thing you need to make out of it. And because that needs a good amount of water, I decided to use packaged water and get it from the ocean over there. And even though the distance isn't too far, I have to say this packaged loop worked out great. Considering I have had all sorts of issues with pipes, I'm pretty glad I went this route. Plus it just looks cool. To make all of the time crystals I needed, I have 2 full floors of just converters. And then we go to the next floor, and it's all particle accelerators. And then the very top floor is converters and quantum encoders. So this was a very power-hungry factory. The last major factory I needed to build before the space elevator parts, more singularity cells. Using the last 16 of the pressure conversion cubes that I'm making, and bringing in a few more things by train, I was able to make 160 singularity cells per minute, 100 of which are going to the ballistic warp drives. This is using pretty much all the remaining copper that's out in the desert, and that wasn't quite enough, so I still needed to bring in over 1,500 copper powder. And to make that, I came back to where it all started in the save. If you're picking the northern forest as your start point, there's a good chance you're building at least some factory here. It has 4 pure iron nodes and 2 pure copper nodes, and a limestone node that I'm not even using. It's a great location. So to make the 1,500 copper powder, I need a little over 3,000 of both the iron and the copper ore. Even though the pure copper gives you a slightly better ratio, I love just how simple the copper alloy ingot is. You have to really try to use all the iron ore in the world. So in my opinion, this is a fantastic recipe for these. And I originally forgot to add the water. This factory is pretty thirsty also. It needs over 6,000 water. And I was pretty proud of the way this came out. I decided to make a giant pipe out of concrete pillars and shove all of the pipes that I needed into there. Even though I probably could have got the water from right down there, I thought it would be way more fun just to use good old gravity and use the lake that's right up on top. And up here, I've just got a whole bunch of water extractors, and then they just feed into that giant pipe. I had plenty of sulfur left over in the world, so I wanted to try the leached copper ingot recipe, and it actually worked out fantastic. And the big benefit is you just get to cut down the amount of machines. So if I had gone the pure copper ingot route, I would have used more than double the amount of refineries. So I think it was worth it. This was another factory I decided, since I was at the end and I have plenty of space in the world, I just decided to let this take up a whole lot of room. And I'm glad I did. The endgame machines deserve a little bit of space. One last biome to visit before we make it over to the grassy fields. I ended up turning the entire Spire coast into time crystals. And some reanimated sand. I have 2 train stations out here that are connected to the main railway, and I think they're both doing the exact same amount, where they're turning 1,600 crude oil into 160 time crystals. Like I said, I really like this oil-based diamond recipe, because it's just 1 particle accelerator and 2 converters for every 300 crude oil. If it's a normal node, you just need 1, and if it's a pure node, you just need 2. And so as you can see, I have those scattered around all over the place, because I figured might as well keep the oil pipes more or less as short as possible. And by keeping them small like this, I can kind of find spots where I can nestle them in and not have to interfere with too much of the terrain, because this is just a really cool looking biome. Yep, the other train station is doing the same amount of crude oil, but this one is the one that's shipping out the SAM. And it's got my portal, just in case I ever need to quickly come out here. Then, it was finally time to build the AI expansion server factory. I picked this location because I hadn't built anything in the grassy fields yet, and it was fairly close to some of the other things that I needed to bring in, such as that new aluminum factory. As far as the factory goes, it's actually really small and compact. Half this thing is just the train station. Since I was at the endgame, I wanted to switch things up and try some of the recipes I don't normally use. So I am using the instant scrap alternate. So you just need bauxite, coal, sulfuric acid, and water. So I just paired up the sulfuric acid with the blender, and then that way the wastewater from the blender could just feed right into the sulfuric acid, and those numbers just match up perfectly. And then you just pair it up with some more smelters, and I've got an extra 1,200 aluminum ingots. I like the way that this turned out. Those aluminum ingots just go on a journey down a spiral, across that gap, and into the new factory. We've got another decent sized train station, and then right attached to it is the factory. And here we've got the inputs and outputs. So this was another factory that was producing way more dark matter residue than I needed, but instead of messing with the recipes, I wanted to create the most amount of dark matter crystals as possible. So very similar style, but instead of just going completely vertical, I kind of went ahead at diagonal and just worked with the terrain. This is another factory where I got good use out of the sushi belt. which there are definitely times where I loved it and kind of hated it. But the great thing about the sushi belts is it really just kind of shows you where any issues arise much quicker, because once one thing backs up, then everything else that's attached to that sushi belt is going to come crashing down pretty quickly. And I've kind of designed my whole world to be it all works or it doesn't. So as frustrating as sushi belts can be because you come back and just everything is kind of stopped or frozen up, I don't think it's the worst thing because I just want to make sure the factories work. This factory is producing the second to last of the space elevator parts I needed, and almost all of the rest of the dark matter crystals. But for the last couple I needed, I just threw down one more tiny little factory onto the back of this thing. Just using the pure SAM node that's right above here, and just turning it all into dark matter crystals. With the AI expansion servers done, there's only one last major part to build. But that's the one I really wanted to scale up, which meant that I was still going to be short a few more materials. And that's when I built the tower over there at the west coast, which from this far away, apparently you can't see the refineries, but hey, the lifts and the belts still show up. And then I also built this little guy just right above the waterfalls. This is producing the last bits of copper sheets and Caterium ingots that I was going to need. Using some nearby pier nodes and my almost unlimited amount of water, building it right on the water, this is producing over 1,000 copper sheets and over 500 Caterium ingots. And with this one I wanted to put the train station just right there in the middle. Which finally brings us to the ballistic warp drive factory. Here are the inputs and the one and only output for this factory. The very last step of manufacturers is completely overclocked and slooped. So really I'm only manufacturing 20, but because of the sloops, it's giving me 40. And because you only need like 200 of these to finish the game, it only took 5 minutes once this thing was completely up and running. Now this is just providing me a nice and steady 115 million sync points. And this factory has a good amount of everything. There's sushi belts and a lot of ratio splits and load balancing going on here. I think the best thing I can do for this factory is just give you some cinematic shots of it. "40 ballistic warp drives per minute." Oh, they're so cool looking. So now let's take a look at some stats. The good old awesome sync. We are looking pretty good. Looks like my low is about 129 and it peaks at like 135. So looks like I'm averaging over 130 million points per minute. That is awesome. And for no good reason, I decided to add a whole bunch of these little guys to the roof. Unfortunately, when you reload the save, it turns all of the little flashing lights off. So I'd have to jump in all of them and turn them back on again. I threw the save into the Satisfactory Calculator interactive map so we can take a quick look at it. I did have to turn off a few things here. All the buildings in the power grid are turned off, but all of the structures are turned on. So all of the foundations, the rail lines, and all that sort of stuff are still shown here on the map. And just to take a quick look at some of the stats here, it looks like I collected 252 out of the 298 Mercer Spheres and 100 out of the 106 Summer Sloops. And there's still 2 hard drives I didn't collect, but I had more than enough. Alright, so let's just go through some fun stats real quick. Parts produced. Out of all of the things in the world, It's copper ingots that I'm producing the most of. I'm not entirely sure why the water is so drastically off. I'm pretty sure my world would not be working if I was only producing that little. Here are all the creatures I've killed, and, well, don't look too close. We can move on. Here's all the shameful manual crafting that I did. I really don't remember making that much biomass in the beginning, but I'm sure that I just queued it up and walked away at some point. Buildings constructed. I used a lot of power lines. And go figure, a lot of Mark 1 belts. And out of the parts used, surprise, surprise, concrete is number 1. Almost 360,000 concrete I went through in this save. There's one last new thing I want to show off in this save. For that, we're going to take our portal back to the hub. And now I can show you my little teleportation hub. As you just saw on the map, I use trains all over the place. And originally, each of these major train stations had my own personal train station. And that way, I could jump in a train, I could say go to the Dune Desert, or go to the Rocky Desert, or send me out to the Blue Crater. And then I could just kind of sit back and enjoy the 5-10 minute train ride, and I'd show up where I wanted. But once I got to the late game, I got to basically repurpose all of those train stations and then just add a portal into the major building. And so it started off with just these 10 that are all around the edge. And then I added one final one. And because these need 2 singularity cells each, I'm making 160 per minute over at that factory. 100 of which are going to the ballistic warp drives, but 60 of them are just being sunk. So I split off 2 of them, put them on the short little train that stays within the Dune Desert here that makes its way out to this factory. And that's how I'm powering my trophy cave. Without further ado, let's take a look. And it spits us out right into a cave. So I've got my awesome shop here just in case I need to do some last minute shopping. I do still have quite a few coupons here. And then if we turn the corner, we've got my little haul. Here is the culmination of all of my hard work. I had already bought 1 golden nut and I moved it over here. I don't still have 1 sitting at the hub. But I was able to buy 2 of every single statue and a total of 3 golden nuts. I still had some extra alien augmenters, so might as well just throw 1 in here. And we've got some extra batteries just in case. Why not, right? Obviously, if I wanted a portal to get in and out of here quickly, that needs a little bit of power as well. That is going to do it for this world tour. Thank you so much for being here. And a special thank you to everyone that likes, comments, and hypes the videos. It really does help. As I mentioned in the beginning, the save, blueprints, spreadsheet, and diagrams are all free on my Google Drive. I'm sure some of you have thoughts on how I could fix the couple of pipe issues I still have, so please let me know in the comments. I'll definitely be able to try some of them out in the next playthrough. Luckily enough, I finished this one in just enough time to start over in 1.2. I'm still not sure how hard I want to make it by turning up the difficulty with the new settings, so let me know what you all would like to see me try. I do still plan on starting to stream from time to time, I'm sure most of which will be Satisfactory, but there are some other games I would like to play. So look forward to all that, and thanks for watching.